Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, a few technical things just to make sure that we've got the screens. So just a bit of background of my experience to put into context the commitment and passion of supporting my choice is the voluntary legal advice sector that I have had the privilege to work in. Starting as a volunteer some 25 years ago, I saw firsthand how the rule of law was used to protect people's rights, often at a point of crisis and extreme vulnerability. This caught my interest and I have not looked back since, and I was absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to lead and join a talented team at Legal Services Agency, and I joined the organisation in December 2019, just shortly before the world changed due to the pandemic. But what also it highlighted was the considerable impact of inequalities. Legal Services Agency is a national law centre, and we focus on providing a voice and protecting the rights of people who are often led to feel as if they have no influence and no choice. Working from our main offices in Glasgow and Inverclyde, we have a national remit and specialise in social welfare law and public law, and are known to develop novel legal remedies to tackle systemic failures. Our vision is of a fair society where social justice is available for people who would otherwise find it difficult to access legal assistance, and that they have the right expert on their side when they need it. We advocate for human rights and empowerment through legal remedies and shared learning. We work in partnership with the belief that change can only be achieved by working in collaboration. Just a little bit about our areas of specialism. So we specialise in all areas of housing, but with a particular focus on preventing homelessness. In mental health, we cover a specialism of supporting those that have incapacity and or brain injuries. In criminal injuries, we support those that have been affected by criminal offences. We work in partnership with citizens' advice bureaus and advice organisation in social welfare matters, and particularly challenging refusal of entitlement to welfare benefits and health-related benefit access, and responding to the community needs over the pandemic. We re-established our employment law service. And again, we've got a particular focus in all our areas of law, as you might have gathered, and the particular focus in employment is tackling discrimination and unfair employment practices, and particularly over the pandemic, health and safety issues. We've also got a very strong legal education element, and we are a registered CPD provider. And through that, we raise awareness of topical issues and underrepresented areas of information. To be without a home is unthinkable. Yet around 40,000 people become homeless in Scotland each and every year. 11,804 children were assessed as homeless in the last financial year. That's 32 children every single day. Nearly half of the homeless applications last year were due to relationship breakdown or being asked to leave. 1 in 10 households in Scotland are affected by dampness or condensation, or both. There are 613 households in Scotland that are in fuel poverty. Homelessness has a devastating cost to individuals and society. Being without secure housing restricts access to education, employment, and healthcare. The consequence is a social and economic burden that we cannot afford, but should, and equally, should not tolerate. Children living in insecure temporary accommodation, families losing jobs and struggling to make ends meet, ill health, particularly undiagnosed, are more prevalent and more difficult to manage. Homelessness is too often individualised in our society, couched in the belief that it is a person's circumstances that have largely shaped by their choice and moral character. But the cause of homelessness are structural, societal, and political, restricting choice. If we are to succeed in ending homelessness, we need to focus on delivering systemic solutions to systemic problems. So it's quite clear that homelessness and its costs are not borne equally. Children, LGBTQI, and Black and minority ethnic communities are all more likely to become homeless. But paths into homelessness are many, varied, complex, and nuanced. Paths that are fraught with difficulty and barriers. Some groups are at a higher risk of homelessness than others and suffer its worst consequences. If we start by looking at gender, women are more likely to be living in poverty. They are more likely to become homeless following relationship breakdowns and find it more difficult to access and maintain some types of accommodation. Women are much more likely to live in poverty, in part because they comprise the majority of low-paid workers and a majority of unpaid carers. Without financial resources, they are prevented from accessing the private rented sector and home ownership. We look at men, especially those aged 35 to 64. They are most at risk of rough sleeping, persistent homelessness, and more likely to suffer the direst consequences of homelessness. Men make up 86% of those who have rough slept in the past 3 months. They make up 2/3 of those who fall into repeat and persistent homelessness. They're twice as likely to die while roofless. Other communities enter and experience homelessness differently. Notwithstanding higher than average educational attainment, Black and minority ethnic people have lower incomes, higher rates of unemployment, and according to Joseph Rowntree Foundation, lower take-up of housing benefit despite entitlement. This appears in large part to be attributed to lack of awareness of public services, poor access to support, and experiencing discrimination. Without vital support with housing costs, Black and minority ethnic communities face considerable hurdles in accessing and maintaining adequate housing. They are more likely to be overcrowded and to live in cold, damp, and unsuitable housing. If we look at Gypsy traveller communities, research from Equality and Human Rights Commission found that for every indicator required to live a happy and fulfilled life, Gypsy travellers were worse off than any other community in Scotland. This includes access to housing, the risk of homelessness. At LSA, we're instructed by a number of Scottish Gypsy travellers who live in intolerable housing, from damp and cold to that with significant risk of ethnicity-based violence and abuse. The LGBTQI community, and especially trans people and young people, face an altogether unacceptable risk of homelessness. Their paths to homelessness often feature domestic violence and being required to leave the family home. LGBT Youth Scotland reported that 15% of LGBTQI young people have been forced to leave their home, a figure which increases to 22% for trans young people. No recourse to public funds is a restriction that is imposed by immigration legislation reserved to the UK government. What it essentially does is prevents people from being able to access any benefits and access any support from local authority housing and homelessness services. It affects a large number of people. It affects people seeking asylum. It affects some people who with insecure immigration status. It affects some people who have discretionary leave to remain, and most people who have a visa condition. So non-EEA nationals and following Brexit, EEA nationals who do not have pre-settled or settled status. Of particular vulnerability are also women within this group who have a dependent spouse visa and are experiencing domestic violence. So I talk about destitution by design, and what I mean by that is that where people have a restriction on not being able to access public funds, they are not able to get the same support mechanisms allowing access to benefits or housing and homelessness assistance. It is the goodwill of communities and voluntary organisations that come to their support should they find themselves in a situation where they are going to be sleeping rough or homeless. Another vulnerable group are people that have been trafficked from outside the UK. They often have no documents and are at an increased risk of homelessness and rough sleeping, particularly during the pandemic and the economic aftermath, where the traffickers have not been able to make any money from them. They find that they have no longer any use for them and they let them go, leaving people vulnerable to destitution and homelessness. The biggest risk factor for homelessness is poverty. Those with greater financial and social resources are less likely to become homeless. Those with stable employment, supportive families, and higher educational attainment all find it easier to access and maintain adequate housing, with greater access to the private rented sector and home ownership. In general, there is stronger evidence that poverty affects housing circumstances rather than housing circumstances affecting poverty. This suggests, however, a fairly obvious relationship. People living in poverty generally have housing which is of a poorer quality and desirability than those with higher incomes. But it discounts something else that we know to be true, which is housing costs are driving force behind people being in poverty. The Edinburgh Poverty Commission found that almost 1 in 3 families in the city living below the poverty line are only in that position due to high housing costs. The same is true for 1 in 8 households in poverty across Scotland. According to the Scottish Government report, 11% of people in Scotland live in persistent poverty after paying housing costs. But this too is unequal. Children are much more likely to live in persistent poverty than working age adults or pensioners, with 17% of children in Scotland in persistent poverty. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlights the same is not true across the board. Those living in social housing are disproportionately likely to live in poverty and disproportionately likely to be affected by housing costs. Around 30% of social renters are living in poverty before housing costs. Despite submarket social rents, more than 40% are living in poverty after housing costs have been paid. The next area that I'd like to talk about is adverse childhood experiences. So the information that I have just shared is reflective of the experience and life stories of the many people that we assist, and a concerning large proportion having had an impact of adverse childhood experiences. Children comprise 16% of Scotland's population, but 25% of homeless people. Amongst the most vulnerable members of our society, children are disproportionately likely to become homeless and to suffer the devastating lifelong consequences. I'd like to draw a bit of our developed understanding of adverse childhood experiences, the stressful events which occur in childhood. These can range from parental abuse, can range from having a relative in prison or spending time in care. It's well established that adverse childhood experiences impact neurological and psychological development and can have devastating consequences later in life. But this has been more widely studied in the context of health, with studies across the world finding that those with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are significantly more likely to develop health problems later in life, ranging from schizophrenia to diabetes. Compared to people with no adverse childhood experiences, those with 4 or more are more likely to have been in prison, to engage in health-harming behaviours such as smoking, recreational drug use, and even go on to develop complicated health conditions. We tend to think of adverse childhood experiences as problems within the family unit, rather than the wider society. But researchers at UCL report that children whose parents report poverty in pregnancy are 9 times more likely to face additional traumatic experiences compared to their wealthier peers. Put simply, those who are unable to meet their basic needs from food to housing are more likely to experience mental health problems, domestic abuse, and substance use. It's against that background that the link between adverse childhood experiences and adult homelessness is now becoming clearer. Those with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are much more likely to become homeless during their adult life and are much more likely than average to have slept rough in the past 12 months. We see this impact on a regular basis. Adverse childhood experiences have real consequences, spanning the neurological, psychological, and social. Adverse childhood experiences impact a person's ability to regulate emotions, overcome challenges, and sustain supportive relationships. This can lead to considerable difficulty accessing, engaging with, and benefiting from support. Those who have experienced the trauma of homelessness once are more likely to become homeless again. And research that Heriot-Watt University conducted found that 16% of homeless adults in Scotland experienced childhood homelessness, compared with the national average of about 5%. So homelessness is intergenerational and inherited through trauma and structural failure. Our experience in the research highlighted demonstrates that the causes of homelessness are structural, they're societal, they are political. So if we are to effect systemic change, it's imperative that we approach homelessness as the structural, societal, and political problem that it is. We have to remind ourselves and those around us that the paths into homelessness are varied and the paths out fraught with difficulty. A person-centred approach is vital. Tailored support backed by evidence, and above all, person-centred and trauma-informed. So to deliver a person-centred approach, we consider that systemic changes need to happen, a rights-based approach, a human rights-based approach. We must change perceptions and narratives of poverty and inequalities if we are to address its root causes and the stigma around it. We need to reframe homelessness from an issue of individual decision-making to one of structural problems with viable solutions. Crisis, in partnership with Frameworks, has undertaken rigorous research on framing what works to drive progressive change around homelessness. And one of the conclusions that they've highlighted is that humanity of those in or at risk of homelessness is vital. So focusing on the experience of homelessness, not as the other, but as people. It's vital that public support for homelessness services and better and fairer housing recognises that. Crisis and Framework also highlight the value of moral human rights approach, the idea that all human beings have a moral right to be treated with dignity and respect. Framing housing as a moral and humanitarian right improves our collective approach to homelessness by dislodging the idea that homelessness person is the other. It's distinct from framing the issue as one of legal rights, which recognising the bias may be a less persuasive argument for the public. We also need to move away from the notion that homelessness is a crisis in need of only an immediate solution. So prevention is better, cheaper, and more humane than cure after the fact. We can and must prevent everyone in Scotland from ever becoming homeless. That also means investing in more housing, especially social housing and affordable rentals. The Scottish Government is still to meet its stated target of 50,000 new social homes. Mixed tenure estates can reduce financial risk and enrich the diversity of communities. So what is the role of the law? So the right to housing has been recognised in international law for more than 50 years, and Scotland has some of the most progressive homeless rights in the world. Yet thousands of people still remain with difficulties in relation to housing and homelessness. Despite this progressive legislation, it is clear that we cannot be complacent. So I'm going to talk about some of the approaches that LSA has adopted in recognising that novel legal remedies are essential to achieve systemic change, and above all, the heart of service delivery is the person that we are seeking to support. So making sure that the service is person-centred and trauma-informed is essential from our experience if people are to understand and to be able to make informed choices. When we started undertaking housing and homelessness cases, virtually no evictions were defended and homelessness remedies were not pursued. Equalities in human rights law were not applied. Reasonableness and technical defences were ignored. As a result of pursuing remedies, publicity and education, and developing the law, the position is now transformed. The First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership published its report on incorporation of economic, social and cultural rights into domestic law some time ago, and the government has been reasonably receptive and has developed a legislative programme starting with incorporating the International Covenant on the Rights of the Child, which also includes housing rights, into our domestic law. We can and should prioritise that programme, including ensuring adequate resources to support it. The European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 3 and 8, are relevant to housing and homelessness. Article 3 prohibits inhumane treatment. Article 8 prohibits interference with private life and home. Article 3 has been rarely relied on in the context of housing, though the courts have found that it could be engaged by homelessness where there are significant personal circumstances such as destitution. Article 8 has been more widely used in enforcing housing rights, requiring, for example, that evictions be reasonable means of achieving a legitimate aim. Despite these provisions, the courts are still hesitant to find breaches of convention rights, with the bar set exceptionally high. There are other vital protection in domestic equality law. So, for example, the Public Sector Equality Duty, which is contained within the Equality Act. This requires local authorities to have regard to protected characteristics such as age, disability, ethnicity. It applies to individual homeless applications, but it also applies to overarching policy. It is a duty which we find many local authorities regularly fail to comply with, yet it is not as much litigated as we would expect. At LSA, we've taken a strategic approach in this area, focusing on achieving systemic changes as well as individual outcomes. We have several cases currently before the courts concerning local authorities' breaches of Equality Act, and in particular, the Public Sector Equality Duty. So despite protective legislative measures, our laws are only as good as their enforcement. I'd like to share a little bit more about the approach that our Housing and General Court Department take. We're instructed on a daily basis by people who are unable to enforce their basic legal rights, from gatekeeping, preventing homeless applications, to insufferable conditions in temporary accommodation. Some very recent examples that we were discussing within the team was a flat that was allocated to a woman in her 80s with mobility issues, and she was allocated a flat on the 3rd floor in a building that did not have a lift. That impacted her ability to leave her home. There are other examples that show the differential consideration of mental health issues compared with physical health in allocation policies. There are many examples of unsuitable temporary accommodation, not recognising the impact of mental health, particularly disregarding cultural and religious practices, not taking into consideration substance use issues. The approach we take is not to turn anybody away who may be at a risk of homelessness, and to defend people to protect their rights to home. We've provided emergency legal representation in Glasgow Sheriff Court to represent those who do not have representation to prevent eviction and homelessness occurring. And we're very grateful that we have now had additional resource to try that at Western Bartonshire Sheriff Court this month. We've had significant experience preventing homelessness for those who have engaged with the criminal justice system and people with severe mental disorders, and those that have been accused of antisocial behaviour. A few notable examples that were highlighted in the Scottish Housing News and Scottish Legal News were a client who we assisted that addressed a disbalance of power, and our client was awarded $1,500, which the landlord was fined because they hadn't protected the tenant's deposit in an approved deposit protection scheme. Another notable outcome was we raised defences on technical grounds that a tenancy should be void because the client had severe learning difficulties and felt intimidated to sign the tenancy. We've achieved thousands of pounds of compensation for tenants who have been living in substandard housing accommodation. From the issues that we experienced, we look at spotting trends, and recently we noted that our clients were accruing debt shortly after moving into temporary accommodation, and we undertook research on charges for temporary accommodation in all 32 local authorities in Scotland. Our findings noted very few local authorities considered the individual's personal ability to pay charges per the Scottish Government's Code of Guidance on Homelessness. High temporary accommodation charges can violate the human right of adequate housing and lead to high levels of personal debt, which can cause significant hardship for homeless people. Scots law at the moment is silent on the matter. However, English case law, in combination with the Scottish legislation, Code of Guidance and advisory standards, suggests that this approach may be unlawful. We will be publishing our report shortly and urge local authorities to employ varied methods to calculate charges and not result it in being a postcode lottery for homeless people. We would be urging local authorities to review what they charge and ensure that it is affordable. Our research showed that the total level of debt owed by individuals to local authorities in respect of temporary accommodation is upwards of 33.3 million. Attempts to mitigate debt after charges have been issued by writing off arrears are inadequate solutions of unaffordable temporary accommodation. Finally, in terms of strategic litigation and approaches to help ensure homelessness rights work in practice, and that everyone who has the misfortune of finding themselves without a safe home is able to enforce their rights in law, we believe that there needs to be greater investment in legal aid and publicly funded legal advice and representation for our most vulnerable, which are key in ensuring access to justice. But we also believe that civil society needs to work together to identify systemic problems to bring about systemic changes. And there are many examples through the Everyone Home Collective of positive engagement between the organisations, but also with Scottish Government to recognise the unequal impact of homelessness. Another example that I would like to share is that of an organic partnership that came together through the Roof Coalition in Glasgow a few years back when asylum seekers were facing eviction as a result of Serco, the Home Office accommodation provider, undertaking lock changes. From that group, there is the Glasgow Social Justice Lawyers, which consists of Govan Law Centre, Just Right Scotland, Shelter, Lata & Co and ourselves. We established the impact for asylum seekers that were facing destitution and they did not have the legal recourse to have a solicitor represent them. We wrote to the Scottish Government and are very pleased to report that the Scottish Government have accepted the submissions and the evidence of the violation of rights for asylum seekers, and there have been changes now implemented in the legislation for the very first time in Scotland that provides asylum seekers the same right to legal representation when they are facing destitution compared to other types of eviction. So finally, just in conclusion, understanding the complexity and interlinkage of homelessness is key to ensuring everyone has a safe place to call home. It is a colossal problem. It might even seem unsurmountable. But with individual and collective approach, keeping the individual at the centre of service delivery, we can end homelessness and ensure that every person in Scotland is enabled and can exercise their choice and has access to safe and secure housing that takes account of their individual needs. At LSA, we will continue to work with our partners to deploy legal remedies to tackle these issues on the ground to achieve real concrete gains where the law permits. And where the law doesn't permit, we will continue to identify the gaps and campaign for reform. Legal remedies are not a substitute for other forms of campaigning. Change can only come from a consequence of many factors. Pursuing legal remedies, however, can help reforms become real. They can help identify gaps, as well as crucially ensuring that the rights and individuals' needs of people who are otherwise without a voice have an equal choice. Thank you for the opportunity to share what LSA does, working with many partners in supporting people experiencing homelessness exercise their choice and control and be enabled to make informed choices.